Have you ever been watching Instagram or TikTok and come away feeling more anxious than when you started? If you're being honest, the answer to that is yes. You played the social media slot machine, your emotions pinballing through the algorithm. And the algorithm doesn't just play on your emotions, it uses them as a delivery system for ideas. And it feeds these ideas back to you constantly until, in the end, you're living in your own little bubble, an echo chamber that feels like reality itself. And yet, most people never stop to notice how many ideologies are baked into the content they watch. I mean, nobody watches a what I eat in a day TikTok and thinks, there's an ideology. But for many people, carnivores, vegans, God knows whatever else is out there, what starts as a desire to be healthy winds up turning into something like a religion. And health is just one example, by the way. I mean, the same pattern shows up everywhere you look: politics, spirituality, philosophy. And the reason is simple. In the absence of an overarching worldview, the psyche tends to go looking for something it can elevate. We seek out organizing principles for our lives, which is exactly what these ideologies are selling. I mean, two things really: meaning and certainty. Yet somehow, they never seem to quite stick. And in the end, they feel vaguely compulsive. And perhaps because they were never intended to carry that weight in the first place. For the majority of human history, religion met those needs, and it did it quite well by and large. But for many people nowadays, a growing amount of people, honestly, it no longer seems to hold. So that's what this video is going to be about: this hunger for meaning, and why our current attempts to satisfy it seem to keep falling short. And the answer, I think, comes from a source that might surprise you: a Swiss psychiatrist writing in the last century, whose ideas have never been more relevant. So that psychiatrist's name was Carl Jung. And to understand why his ideas matter now, we need to start first by zooming out and looking at how consciousness collectively develops over time. So for Jung, progress within any field of thought tends to follow a particular process that he calls differentiation. What this means is that new values or ways of seeing the world tend to take precedence over the old ones, while the old ones get pushed into the background. And in psychodynamic terms, this is what's called repression. Things that get repressed tend to compensate unconsciously, which means that cultural advancement often looks less like steady progress and more like a pendulum that swings from one extreme to the other. And this is a pattern that shows up so reliably in the history of ideas that you think we would have noticed it by now and done something about it. Take atheism, for example. The new atheist movement built its entire reputation on reason and rational discourse. But what was particularly striking about it was actually the emotional intensity that some of its proponents had towards anyone who disagreed. The sense of conviction and outright hostility could really only be described as dogmatic. I mean, there's a particular kind of person who will explain to you a few decibels too loud and with evident moral fervor that religion is irrational. And the irony tends to escape them. So for Jung, reason was a recently acquired function of the psyche, but it's just one function. It's not the whole thing. It can't eliminate what it deems as irrational through sheer willpower. Any attempt to do so merely represses it, only for it to reappear as a very emotionality and dogmatism that it claims to transcend. And in many ways, the new atheist movement was itself a reaction to something: the declining authority of religion. When a religion loses its ability to provide meaning collectively, it tends to leave behind a vacuum. And in psychology, just as with nature, vacuums don't stay empty for very long. What we see instead is a proliferation, in this case, of ideologies. So political movements multiply and fracture into increasingly smaller units, to the point where nowadays alternative movements in the same party are seemingly opposed to one another. And spirituality gets highly fragmented and individualized too. It's almost like someone picking around at a buffet, you know? Take a little Buddhism for mindfulness, maybe some astrology to give your personality a cosmic backstory, some pagan symbolism for visual branding. Oh, and my favorite part, sprinkle in a dash of neuroscience just to make it sound like respectable, peer reviewed even. And obviously, I'm joking here, but you can understand the logic behind it. I mean, when meaning is no longer culturally provided, people are left to assemble it for themselves. The problem, of course, is that it's tacked on, doesn't emerge organically from within, which is why the underlying tension remains, even if it feels like a relief for a little while. So, historically, religion didn't work this way, right? It wasn't a spiritual smorgasbord where you just kind of pick and choose your favorite parts of each. People didn't choose their religion, they just grew up inside it. And there was no concern whether its metaphysical claims were actually true or not. That's a modern preoccupation. Religious symbols were living realities, stories that organized experience, rituals that shaped behavior, images that carried genuine psychological weight. All of this works underneath the level of conscious reflection. So, if religion was able to shape the psyche so deeply, the natural question that arises is how? And the answer to that is not abstract belief. At its core, it was ritual. Specifically, it's what earlier cultures called magic. And before we get carried away here, I'm not talking about Harry Potter, nor am I talking about, you know, saging your apartment, charging your crystals under the full moon, or whatever's in that package that your girlfriend just bought on Etsy. What I mean is something far older and actually far stranger. I'm talking about magic as symbolic action intended to redirect instinct away from its immediate aim and toward a shared purpose. Jung describes an example of this with a fertility ritual practiced by the Wakandi, an Australian Aboriginal tribe. The men of the group get together and dig an oval shaped hole into the ground, set about with bushes, in order to resemble the female genitalia. They then dance around this bush, thrusting their spears into it rhythmically. And through the shouting and the intensity of the ceremony, they work themselves up into a state of ecstasy until the analogy starts to feel real. And in order not to disturb this illusion, women are forbidden from being present during the ceremony. Now, if your friend group was anything like mine in middle school, you may have had a buddy who was rumored to have done something similar here. So, I want to be clear that I'm describing a fertility ritual. This ritual takes the sexual instinct and redirects it toward a symbolic aim, the land itself. The earth becomes, by analogy, the object of fertility. Libido, psychological energy, is withdrawn from its immediate discharge and invested into the future, into the conditions of life that sustain the group as a whole. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the transformation of instinct through symbol. Ritual acts like these create a kind of gap between impulse and action. And what emerges in that gap is the development of a will, really, that can at least partially detach itself from the autonomy of instinct, from its pull. And this development, Jung argued, is a necessary precondition for a culture itself. See, you can't build a civilization if every instinct flows towards its natural aim. You need some mechanism to redirect it. Otherwise, we'd be no different than the rest of the animal kingdom. And there's a further consideration here that's easy to miss. Ritual acts like these set the stage for causal thinking. Now, of course, the ritual doesn't physically cause fertility, but it creates a kind of analogy, an as if relationship between action and outcome. And over time, these symbolic and mythic projections get stripped away. What you're left with is the attention that the ritual directs it towards, the land, the conditions of growth. So a tribe learns that when you plant in this way and at this time, you get this result. So you have observation and regularity, the very foundations of scientific thought. And in this sense, science doesn't just replace magic, it actually emerges from it. Which is why Jung remarked that magic was once regarded as the mother of science. But here's the irony. The same rational function that emerges from the symbolic ground of the psyche now denies the very thing that made it possible. And that's not like a trivial loss. This symbolic ground is where meaning arises. Because reason tends to mistake itself for the whole of the psyche, that connection gets severed. So, it might be tempting to look at the situation and conclude that religion has failed us. But I'm not sure that's quite right. I mean, from the earliest primitive cultures up through the Age of Enlightenment, religion was the cultural vessel for meaning. What we're witnessing now is like an evolution, a point at which the collective containers can no longer do the work alone, and the individual is left to take up the task. In other words, what was once unconsciously carried by collective symbol and ritual must now be consciously earned by the individual. See, there's a difference between belief and knowing. They're not the same. Belief is inherited, it's secondhand. And its opposite, skepticism, is just a reaction to that. Neither touch anything real. Knowing comes from direct inner encounter. This is precisely why Jung could say, with a wry smile, when asked whether he believed in God, that he didn't have to believe. He knew. That kind of knowing isn't available through doctrine or tradition. It has to be won individually, which is considerably harder, but in the end, far more meaningful. And I think this is actually the defining psychological challenge of the 21st century. This is what Jung called individuation, the process by which a person becomes more fully themselves, finding a relationship to their own depths that's truly genuine. Now, this won't feel urgent to everyone, but consider this. This same meaning vacuum that we've been describing also makes us increasingly susceptible to collective currents, mass movements, political ideologies, the echo chamber that feels like reality. Having an anchor in yourself that the current can't dislodge might be the only real antidote to all of that. That said, Jung developed this work primarily with a particular kind of patient. People who were educated, successful, often in the second half of life. People who had, by most external measures, done everything right, but still found themselves at a loss. So for a long time, individuation carried that flavor. Something for the affluent and the introspective. But in my view, that situation has changed. The collapse of collective containers, this proliferation of ideologies, the dangers of these virtual echo chambers. Individuation is no longer a concern for the fortunate few. It's no longer a luxury. It's precisely where the real work begins, if it calls to you.